Good now. Can everybody hear me okay? So just to introduce myself, my name is Samia Rahman and I'm the Deputy Director of the Muslim Institute. I'll just begin with a couple of housekeeping rules. There are toilets just behind you there. There's a kitchen area where you can make yourself a tea and a coffee. There are juices and biscuits and snacks. We do have our wonderful photographer here, Ivan, who will be taking photographs. If you don't wish to have your photograph taken, if you could let me know, or let Ivan know, and we could easily edit you out if photographs have been taken, so it's not a problem. We also have Wi-Fi connection in the mezzanine. The password is there. I think there's some notices that kind of give you the password as well. We have a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag, which is MICultures. So feel free to tweet and hashtag away. Let's trend. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I would like to thank you all for coming here today. It is my hope that together today we can disentangle the cultures of intolerance that engulf our discourse and seem to dominate our narrative. And perhaps today we can even go some way to making some sense of the state we're in. I think it's fair to say that the past year, or more than the past year, has been quite bewildering, not just bewildering, but shocking and unfathomable. I've really despaired at the constant stream of images displaying the unthinkable horror and brutality, whether it's the so-called Islamic State, the misery in Syria, the inhumanity in Nigeria, and then, of course, at the beginning of this year in Paris, we had the massacre at Charlie Hebdo, and then the murder of shoppers in a kosher supermarket. And I find myself asking, and I've been asked, and everybody's asking why. But I don't know why. But I do know that there are conversations that need to take place in a safe space, and it's my hope that here today, because we at the Muslim Institute celebrate and cherish critical thinking, that we will have those conversations. Now, Islam in its early years thrived on a tradition of critical thinking, and what we at the Muslim Institute, with our annual Ibn Rushd lecture and our winter gathering, with our quarterly publication, Critical Muslim, which we have a Critical Muslim table that Hassan is in charge of, with our publication, which you can buy at a discounted price, I do believe. What we're attempting to do is revive this tradition of critical thinking. We want to open up the strands of debate, as has been done throughout history. Debate, discussion, reasoning, these were all regularly practiced by the Prophet and his companions. Contrary to the propaganda of so-called IS, as well as the Islamophobes, this culture of critical thinking was the beating heart of Islam. It embodied the true spirit of what it means to be a Muslim. You can find in the Quran, in chapter 8, verse 22, that the worst of beasts are said to be those who do not think. And here, today, the Muslim Institute wants to make visible those conversations and discussions that we know are going on between Muslims and the rest of society every day. By projecting the vibrancy of thinking and ideas that already exist and which sadly have been overshadowed, we can own our problems and be a part of the solution. Otherwise, solutions will be imposed upon our communities. So I'm glad you're all here today to be a part of this discussion, and I would like to now hand over to and introduce the Muslim Institute's Chair of Trustees and author of Critical Muslim, Ziauddin Sardar.
As most of you probably know, I don't like to speak at the Muslim Institute gathering. I think the job of the chair is to sit at the back and stay quiet. But I often fail to often fail in my goal, and this time Samia and Hassan persuaded me to kind of set the scene, as it were, in the overall what are we talking about. And essentially, I think we are talking about cultures of intolerance in Islam and Muslim societies more than anything else. And it seems, and of course, the other side of the equation, the struggle against intolerance, the fight for free thinking. It seems to me that almost after the death of the Prophet, those who were kind of framing the basic doctrines of Islam had a problem with the other. And the other is not just the women, but also other communities, Christians and Jews, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. The most telling, I think, example of this is that after the death, 24 years, the death of the Prophet, after 24 years, just after 24 years of the death of the Prophet, we have the Battle of the Camel. Now, for me, the Battle of Camel is of paramount importance, because what you have here is that two members of the household of the Prophet are fighting each other. Aisha, his youngest wife, and Ali, his son-in-law and cousin. The Battle of Camel was a pretty violent and brutal affair. So one needs to ask, why is this battle taking place so almost a couple of decades after the Prophet? And from the point of view of Aisha, there were 2 points at issue. One was the position of women. She was incensed at what the previous caliphs, 3 caliphs, had done about the position of women, to such an extent that there were attempts to deny that women could inherit property. But certainly women were asked to stay indoors, were confined, and of course this was against the practice of the Prophet's time, when women were very, very active. They were engaged in warfare. They were in public. They were arguing in the mosques and so on and so forth. So that was the first thing. That the position of women had become important right at the formative phase of Islam. And the second point she was incensed about, and both of these points, in fact, are with us today. The second point she was incensed about was that the new converts to Islam were not accepted on face value, but had to join an Arab tribe. So there was this kind of tribal notion that if you converted to Islam, it was not good enough for you to be who you are, but you had to acquire some sort of Arab identity to be a genuine Muslim. Now these were two, I think, a very crucial point, and Aisha was right to actually take a stand on that. And the Battle of Camel is called Battle of Camel because she actually rode a camel and in fact led her army she was at the head of the army riding a camel. And we know that she lost, and then later on was ordered to she was living in Medina, was ordered in fact to go from Medina to Mecca and be confined at home and not to speak in public and not to be seen in public. So in a sense, it was a very crucial point. Now about the same time that the Battle of Camel was going on, another group of Muslims emerged who we seldom study, but who also have played a very important part in increasing intolerance in Muslim societies throughout history. And these were the Kharijites, or the people who basically the separators, those who had left. And the Kharijites were Puritans, and basically their position was that once revelation has been had kind of arrived, then there could be no argument that history ends with the arrival of revelation, and that means that Muslims are a perfect community, and any Muslim, by definition, should not commit sin or make an error, and the error could be a political error as well. And there could be no negotiation, there could be no questioning of anything. Everything had to be accepted exactly as it was. And those who erred or committed sin, by definition, were then outside Islam and had become apostate, and therefore it was legitimate to kill them. In the beginning, they were incensed about the murder of the third Caliph, Usman, and wanted to see justice done on that. But then, as time progressed, they became more and more fanatical, and indeed they accused Ali of various kind of errors, and they in fact looked on Ali with suspicion. And there was a battle between Ali and the Kharijites, which the Kharijites lost. But the Kharijite thought this idea that history basically ends with the arrival of revelation continues to this day. I mean, it is one of the basic ideas that is embraced, say, by ISIS, but also by the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. It's a very crucial idea. And after that, we have a number of other groups. So in the 8th century, we had the Karamatins, who were just as intolerant as the Kharijites, but unlike the Kharijites, who were aggressively Sunni, Karamatines were basically aggressively Shia. They were a Ismaili group, a Messianic group, and they established a little caliphate in Iraq, in Cuba, and little bits of Syria. And the Karamatines actually believed that all the Muslims had left the path of Islam and were essentially idol worshippers. And one of their practices was to kidnap young people and kind of brainwash them. And they established a society which was very much on the communist line, that everybody was equal, except that the leader was more equal than anybody else. And they kind of had a reign of terror lasting almost 80 years. In fact, they are known to have attacked Makkah itself, and their leader charged in the sacred mosque where his horse did his business and urinated, and he kind of looked at the black stone and said, "You all these worshippers, you worship idols like black stones." And in fact, there was a massacre within the sacred mosque. So this kind of trend, and then after that, couple of centuries later, we of course have the assassins, who were also Ismaili, and their kind of method. The word assassin actually comes from their hashashin. It may be that they use hashish quite a lot, and the assassins were, of course, their basic methodology was political assassination, and one of the most prominent person they assassinated was Nizam al-Mulk, a very enlightened wazir of the Seljuk Empire. So there is this kind of tendency, I think, which is right there at the formative phase of Islam, of presenting Islam as a kind of unchanging, fixed in history, almost kind of messianic faith that has kind of permeated throughout history, and in fact it's with us. In a sense, the ISIS are neo-Kharijites, in fact with Karamatine kind of connotations within their framework. Saudis and the Wahhabis are also a kind of different kind of neo-Kharijites. They have a very similar kind of philosophy. And some of this has become part of our dogma. It's part of what we believe. I mean, this idea of apostasy, for example, which is clearly something that is not in Islam, has become part of our dogma. And we are very quick to accuse other people of being apostate. And once you accuse somebody of apostate, then of course there is the kind of whole mechanism that the apostates have to be killed, etc., etc. I mean, that very obnoxious idea is framed as a doctrine later on. And you have a number of other doctrines, including how women should behave and women should be treated. And all of that has become an essential kind of part of Islam, that most people think is an essential part of Islam. But they all come from a particular kind of historic situation and historic kind of struggles that have taken place. Now, while all this is going on, we have the counter movement of free thinking, which is arguing against these cultures of intolerance. So, right from the beginning, in the 7th and the 8th century, we have a number of thinkers and philosophers who are arguing against that. So, for example, in the 7th century, 8th century, Al-Rawndi basically mocked the kind of dogmatic beliefs of Islam, and he said most of these dogmas are totally irrational. He specifically made fun of the Muslim notion of paradise that Kharjites, Qaramateens, and later on essentially orthodoxy promoted. The idea of the kind of 72 virgins and the idea of Houris, all that. I mean, the 72 virgins emerges with the assassins later on. But in those days, the idea of Houris, if you're going to go to paradise, you're going to get Houris. And he said, well, the idea of Muslim paradise could only appeal to basically sex-starved individuals. It has no real kind of dimension of motivating people to be good. And after there were other people like Ibn al-Qafa who realized that a great deal of this thought is going to become the reason of the state. In other words, a lot of these dogmas that come from the Kharjites and groups like that will be used by the state to justify its authority and to oppress citizens. So he attacked the very idea that these dogmas are kind of integral part of the kind of political authority in Islam. And of course, later on we get this idea of Islamic State. So here is somebody in the 8th century who can actually detect that something like that is going to happen. It takes some time to happen, but we know that throughout the history, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, including the Ottomans, all these people used religion to justify their political authority and to stop criticism and questioning of political authority. And of course, then you have the popular culture as well. So the Arabian Nights, for example, is just one long critique of Muslim dogma and politics. If you look at Arabian Nights, it's a kind of oral storytelling. So what would have is that people get together in the city square like Baghdad or Damascus, and these stories will be acted out. And the citizens would know that the jinn refers to a particular wazir or the Khalifa who's been mocked is in fact such a leader, and so on and so forth. So there was this kind of culture of criticism and satire, which was very much part of the popular culture. And of course, the Arabian Nights evolved. The reason we don't know where it begins and where it ends is that it was a continuous form of criticism that was happening all the time. One way or the other, things were being added, and as political authority changed, new stories developed, and the whole kind of Arabian Night sagas kind of evolved in a sense. And later on, we have lots of other thinkers and philosophers, say people like Ibn Rushd, one of our kind of heroes, because we have an Ibn Rushd lecture every year, who argued that religious dogma should be subjected to rational reasoning, and if it is not seen to be rational, it should be actually rejected. In his book, The Harmony of Reason and Religion, he basically argues that unless you examine many of these doctrines and dogmas that have become part of Islam and are regarded as an intrinsic part of Islam, unless they are questioned and examined from a reasoned perspective, including hadith and some of the kind of theories that have developed. For example, the Sunni theory of the pious community, that we should follow the early companions of the Prophet, and after that we should follow the ones who came after them and those who came after them. So, this tabi'in, that you should follow the tabi'in, the pious community. We basically argued that this is a kind of constructed, manufactured dogma. And if you actually look at the theory of the pious community, and you should follow them, it's basically a theory of decline, isn't it? If you're following, with one leaders of the community, then the next leaders, then the next leaders. It's essentially a theory of decline. And of course, if you look at history itself, it is very difficult to reconcile the fact of what's happening in real history to real people, with all these battles of battle of camels, the battle of Karbala, and lots of other things that are going on after that. It doesn't show a pious community in action, in a sense. It shows it's basically reveals a lot of violence, struggle, conflict, and so on and so forth. So Ziauddin Sardar argued that we should examine the basic doctrines and dogma from the light of reason. It's interesting to note that his ideas were basically rejected within the Muslim civilization, but then adopted in the West. The school of Averroes, which was his Latin name, developed, and then later on laid the foundation for the Enlightenment. Then there was also a whole body of literature called the adab literature of etiquette, that questioned the basic kind of intolerant dogmas of Islam. And the function of the adab literature was to actually bring in humanism and humanize Islam as much as possible, in a sense. In fact, the adab literature laid the foundation for what we later describe as liberal humanism, and that happened in 12th, 13th, 14th century. So there's lots of critical thinking going on at the same time. And right up to kind of modern times, if we come to modern times, for example, we have somebody like Iqbal, the great poet of Southeast Asia. And Iqbal has written lots of poetry, and many kind of anthologies of his poetry exist. But there are two worth mentioning. Is the book Religious Construction in Islam again argues that much of our conventionally accepted dogma has to be ditched, and we need to reconsider and rethink what religious thought in Islam should be. But for me, a much more profound work of Iqbal is The Complaint and Answer. It's a very, very famous epic poem written, I think, in 1932. I got the year right, so you can correct me. Written in 1932, where the poet addresses God, and he says that we are such pious people, so righteous people. We have done this in history. We had the Abbasid, thought and learning, and look at what has happened to us. And you, God, are not fulfilling your promise, and you're letting us down. It's a very classic kind of epic poem. And then a few years later, 1935, 36, he wrote the reply to the complaint. And in the reply, it's God who's addressing the poet. And God is saying that essentially what you have done is created a dogma whose basic function is self-glorification. You are not actually praising me, you have created dogma that is praising yourself in a sense. and a lot of the things you say that are very good in society, if you examine them, they have a very dark side. And that's 1932. I mean, profound kind of analysis of kind of dogmatic and doctrinal structure of Islam. And coming to contemporary times, we have people like Abdul Karim Shorosh, we have a number of other thinkers like that who are basically continuing the tradition of critical thought and arguing that we need to re-examine the whole doctrinal and dogmatic structure of Islam, which has become very intolerant, right up to critical Muslim, which actually does precisely this job. I think the real tragedy is that cultures of intolerance have become dominant, and my way of thinking are becoming even more dominant. I mean, for example, the kind of paranoia and intolerance we see in the last 30 years didn't exist when I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s. It's a phenomena that's very much related to what happened in Saudi Arabia and the Saudi funding of the mosques, not just in Britain but everywhere, and the spread of the Wahhabi thought. On the other hand, even though free thought has a long history, distinguished history in Islam, and has continued right up to this period, it hasn't actually become the mainstream. Throughout Islamic history, it has struggled with orthodoxy, but somehow orthodoxy always won. And for me, the way to move forward, to do something about the kind of intolerance that exists, and some of it, as I said, is very Dr. Rea intolerance, and new things have been added. I mean, classically, for example, we didn't have the blasphemy. That's very much a British invention that then was adopted by Muslims as a religious dogma, in a sense that blasphemy as a religious dogma did not exist before 1960, 1970. We had apostasy, but then they linked it to apostasy, and then it also became a contemporary dogma. So if you go to Pakistan or Egypt, people actually think that blasphemy, as it is very much part of Islam, in a sense. So all of these things are happening, but I think the free thinkers have not really demolished the citadels of orthodoxy. And I think that is our task. If we can do that, then we can actually succeed to some extent in containing all this intolerance and hatred that comes from within Muslim community and is often justified in the name of Islam. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Now, can everybody hear me okay? So just to introduce myself, my name is Samia Rahman and I'm the Deputy Director of the Muslim Institute. I'll just begin with a couple of